Every time you fill up a car, turn on a light, or board a plane, you're burning something ancient. Not ancient, like a few centuries old. Ancient, like before dinosaurs walked the earth. The oil powering most of the modern world began as something almost impossibly small, microscopic creatures, barely visible even under a lens, drifting in a warm tropical sea that no longer exists. They lived, they died, they sank, and somehow, across hundreds of millions of years, they became the most fought over substance in human history. But here's what most people never stop to think about. Nearly half of all the oil ever found on Earth sits concentrated beneath the deserts of the Middle East, not spread evenly across continents, not distributed by some geological lottery. Why there? Why that much? Why not under Europe or South America or the ocean floor somewhere we'd never fight over? The answer isn't political. It's not cultural. It goes back to a vanished sea. You see, more than 100 million years ago, the region now known as the Middle East was not defined by desert or land. It lay beneath warm, shallow seas that stretched across a stable part of the planet, creating a set of geological conditions so precise, so unlikely, that geologists still study them the way a detective studies a crime scene that was almost perfect. So tonight, we're traveling back through deep time to discover where Earth's oil truly came from and why so much of it formed right beneath the Middle East. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this channel continue to grow. Now, let's dive into those ancient seas and uncover where oil began. Long before anything solid could hold a footprint, before landscapes carried texture or form, there existed a kind of life so small it moved with currents rather than intention. These were not creatures of bone or scale, not the towering figures often imagined when thinking about ancient Earth, but drifting populations suspended within vast waters, countless in number and quiet in presence. They gathered where light reached into the sea, where warmth and chemistry allowed them to exist in steady abundance, forming living layers that stretched far beyond what the eye could ever follow. These organisms belonged entirely to the ocean. They did not crawl, walk, or breathe air, and they never touched land. Their world was fluid and continuous, shaped by tides, sunlight, and the slow circulation of water across immense distances. Day after day, generation after generation, they lived brief and simple lives, multiplying in numbers that defy ordinary scale. Their existence was not marked by individuality, but by accumulation, by the quiet persistence of life repeating itself without pause. What remains important is not how they lived, but what followed after. When these microscopic forms reached the end of their brief existence, they did not vanish into nothing. They became part of something larger, settling gently through the water column, descending into depths where light no longer reached. This descent was constant, a soft and continuous movement of organic matter drifting downward, gathering in places far removed from the surface world, over spans of time that extend far beyond human comprehension. This process repeated without interruption. The ocean became both a place of life and a place of quiet accumulation, where the remains of countless organisms settled and rested. Yet even with such vast numbers, this alone was not enough. Most of what fell would ordinarily return to simpler forms, broken down and recycled by natural processes that leave little behind. The default state of life is disappearance, not preservation. For something different to occur, conditions had to align with unusual precision. The environment needed to limit decay, to slow the processes that would normally erase all traces of what once lived. Without this, the material would never persist long enough to become anything more. Even with continuous accumulation, Without the right balance of surroundings, nothing lasting could form. Time itself played an equally essential role, not years or centuries, but stretches of duration so immense they reshaped the very surface of the planet. Within these spans, the buried remains were gradually altered, not by sudden force, but through steady transformation. Heat, pressure, and depth worked together in silence, changing the nature of what had once been living matter into something entirely new. This transformation was neither guaranteed nor common. It depended on a sequence of conditions that had to remain stable over immense periods, each one building upon the last. If any part of this sequence failed, the process would simply stop, leaving no trace of what might have been. The result is something rare, formed only where time, environment, and accumulation intersect with near perfect alignment. What emerges from this is not merely a resource, but a consequence of persistence under constraint. It begins with life so small it is nearly invisible, continues through conditions that prevent its disappearance, and unfolds across timescales that reshape entire regions of the earth. Without every step holding together, nothing forms at all, and the silence of absence becomes the more common outcome. There were periods in Earth's history when the boundary between water and life became almost indistinguishable, when the seas themselves seemed to carry a living presence from surface to depth. In these ages, the arrangement of continents allowed vast stretches of shallow water to spread across the planet, forming broad marine shelves where sunlight could reach easily and consistently. These regions were neither deep nor dark, but gently illuminated, warmed by the sun, and held in relative stability for immense spans of time. Within these shallow expanses, energy moved freely. Sunlight entered the upper layers of the ocean and was captured continuously by microscopic life, converted into growth at a pace that rarely slowed. The process unfolded everywhere at once, across distances so wide they defy simple measurement, creating a steady rhythm of production that persisted across generations without interruption. The surface waters became engines of quiet creation, sustaining populations that renewed themselves again and again. What emerged was not a scattered presence of life, but a density that reshaped entire marine systems. These organisms did not exist in isolation. They formed vast, drifting communities, layered and intertwined, their numbers rising and falling with subtle changes in light, temperature, and nutrient flow. The oceans became thick with this activity, not visibly crowded in a way the eye might recognize, but saturated in a way that altered the chemistry of the water itself. Every cycle of growth added to the overall presence, building a continuity that stretched across time. Beneath this surface abundance, the structure of the ocean supported the process. Nutrients circulated upward from deeper layers, carried by slow currents that fed the upper zones where light remained constant. This exchange allowed life to persist without depletion, maintaining a balance that favored continuous expansion rather than collapse. The system did not depend on sudden bursts or isolated events. It relied on stability, on the quiet consistency of conditions that allowed life to flourish without disruption. The result was a scale of biological presence that far exceeded what exists in modern oceans. Today, life is distributed unevenly, often limited by temperature, depth, or nutrient availability. In these earlier periods, those limitations were softened by geography and climate, allowing vast areas to remain productive at the same time. The oceans were not only filled with life, they were sustained by it, shaped by processes that operated in near permanence. This sustained abundance created a continuous output of organic material, a steady accumulation that followed naturally from the density above. Each cycle of growth contributed to what came next, not as isolated events, but as part of an ongoing sequence that never fully reset. The system moved forward without pause, carrying with it the remnants of everything that had come before, building layer upon layer in a manner so gradual it remained almost imperceptible. Such conditions did not occur everywhere, nor did they last indefinitely. They depended on a delicate alignment of geography, climate, and ocean circulation, each factor supporting the others in a balance that could persist only under specific circumstances. Where this balance held, life expanded in ways that left a lasting imprint. Where it did not, the pattern shifted and the density diminished. In these ancient seas, life was not a fleeting presence, but a dominant force, quiet in its individual parts, yet immense in its collective scale, shaping the foundation for processes that would continue far beneath the surface, long after the waters themselves had changed. If a single drop could be traced backward through time, it would not lead to a single origin, but to an accumulation so vast it resists clear boundaries. What appears concentrated in the present is the result of an almost unimaginable gathering, built not from isolated events, but from repetition carried across immense spans of time. Each unit, small and seemingly insignificant, contributes to something that only becomes visible when viewed at a scale far beyond ordinary perception. The substance that eventually forms does not arise from abundance alone, but from density, sustained without interruption. The earlier presence of life, already immense in its reach, was only the beginning. For anything lasting to emerge, that presence had to persist continuously, adding layer upon layer of organic matter in a manner that never truly reset. The accumulation required was not measured in seasons or generations, but in durations so long they begin to merge into a single, extended process. Each microscopic organism contributed only a fraction, a nearly negligible amount of material that by itself held no lasting significance, yet the process did not depend on individuals. It relied on repetition, on the constant renewal of life, occurring in such numbers that the total output began to exceed what natural systems could immediately disperse or recycle. The scale of this repetition becomes difficult to grasp, as it requires imagining not millions or billions, but quantities that extend far beyond intuitive counting. To produce even a small volume of what would later become oil, the number of contributing organisms would reach into the trillions upon trillions, each one part of a continuous chain that stretched across vast intervals. This accumulation did not occur in a single location or moment, but across wide regions where conditions allowed such density to persist. The process depended on both magnitude and duration, neither of which could be reduced without breaking the sequence entirely. What makes this more unusual is how easily the process could fail. Even in environments where life was abundant, the balance required for accumulation could be disrupted. A slight shift in conditions, a change in circulation, or a variation in chemical composition could reduce the overall output or interrupt the steady build that was necessary. The system required not just large numbers, but consistency, a sustained presence that could continue without significant interruption. This need for continuous, large-scale accumulation introduces a natural limitation. Only certain regions, during specific periods, could maintain such conditions. Elsewhere, life might flourish briefly, only to decline or disperse before any meaningful accumulation could occur. The difference lies not in the presence of life itself, but in the ability of that life to persist at scale long enough to contribute to something beyond its immediate cycle. Over time, this imbalance shaped the distribution of what would eventually form. Areas where accumulation remained steady began to gather the necessary volume, while others, despite moments of richness, failed to reach the required threshold. The process did not reward short bursts or isolated abundance. It favored continuity, scale, and an almost uninterrupted sequence of growth and decline, repeating over immense spans. What emerges from this is a quiet constraint embedded within the system itself. The formation of oil is not simply a matter of life existing, but of life existing in overwhelming quantities, sustained across durations that allow accumulation to surpass loss. Without this, the process never progresses beyond its earliest stages, leaving behind no trace of what might have been built. In most places across the planet, the end of life is followed by a quiet and efficient return to simplicity, a process so consistent that it leaves almost no record behind. What once carried structure and complexity is gradually taken apart, reduced to its basic components, and reintroduced into the surrounding environment. This transformation happens not through sudden force, but through countless microscopic interactions that unfold steadily and without pause. The presence of oxygen plays a central role in this process. Where it is available, it allows communities of bacteria to thrive, feeding on organic remains and breaking them down piece by piece. These organisms operate continuously, dissolving complex molecules into simpler forms that can be reused within the system. Nothing lingers for long under these conditions. The cycle completes itself with quiet precision, ensuring that what once lived does not accumulate in any lasting way. Even in regions where life once gathered in great numbers, this process remains dominant. The scale described earlier, vast and sustained, does not guarantee preservation. Instead, it often fuels the very system that ensures disappearance. The more organic material becomes available, the more active these decomposers become, accelerating the return of matter to its simplest state. In this way, abundance alone cannot overcome the tendency toward breakdown. Movement within the environment further supports this outcome. Currents, shifting layers, and the steady mixing of water or sediment introduce oxygen into places where it might otherwise be limited. This constant exchange maintains conditions that favor decomposition, preventing the isolation needed for anything to persist. Even subtle disturbances can be enough to restart the process, exposing buried material and allowing it to be consumed once again. Over time, this pattern establishes itself as the default condition across most of the Earth. Life appears, flourishes, and fades, leaving behind little more than traces that are quickly erased. The system remains balanced, with inputs and outputs closely matched, ensuring that accumulation does not exceed what can be processed. It is a cycle defined not by what is kept, but by what is continuously removed. There are no visible markers of what has passed through this cycle. No layers remain to record the countless lives that once existed, no gradual build of material waiting beneath the surface. Instead, everything is returned to circulation, becoming part of an ongoing exchange that sustains new growth elsewhere. The past dissolves into the present without interruption, leaving no clear boundary between what was and what is. This widespread efficiency introduces a quiet constraint on what can form. For organic material to persist, it must escape this cycle, avoiding both the presence of oxygen and the reach of organisms that depend on it. Without that escape, nothing accumulates, and the conditions required for transformation never begin. The absence of preservation is not unusual, it is expected. Across oceans and continents, this process unfolds with remarkable consistency. It shapes the fate of nearly all life, regardless of its scale or duration. Only in rare circumstances does this pattern shift, allowing something different to occur. Everywhere else, the outcome remains the same: a steady return to simplicity, leaving behind a world where almost everything that once lived has quietly disappeared without a trace. In certain corners of the ancient world, the familiar cycle of return did not complete itself. The processes that usually dissolved organic remains slowed, then faltered, not through absence of life, but through a subtle shift in the surrounding environment. Here, the balance tilted just enough to interrupt the steady work of breakdown, allowing traces of what had once lived to linger longer than expected. These places shared a quiet limitation, an absence not immediately visible yet deeply influential. Oxygen, so central to the transformation described before, became scarce within these settings. Without it, the communities of bacteria that depended on it could not function with the same efficiency. Their activity diminished, and with that reduction came a change in the fate of organic material. Instead of being fully reduced and returned, portions remained intact, altered only partially as time continued to pass. The conditions that allowed this were not dramatic or sudden. They emerged through gradual shifts in water structure, where layers formed that did not easily mix. In such arrangements, the upper regions could still interact with the atmosphere, while deeper layers became isolated, cut off from regular replenishment. Within these lower zones, oxygen was consumed and not replaced, creating environments where decomposition slowed to a fraction of its usual pace. As material settled into these quieter depths, it entered a space where the usual rules no longer applied with the same force. The remains accumulated gently, each addition resting upon what had come before. There was no abrupt halt to decay, but rather a steady reduction in its intensity, enough to allow fragments to persist. Over extended periods, these fragments began to gather, forming deposits that reflected not a single event, but a continuous sequence of partial preservation. The stability of these environments played a crucial role. Disturbance could easily reintroduce oxygen, restoring the conditions that favored complete breakdown. Yet, in certain regions, the layers remained undisturbed for long durations, maintaining the separation that allowed preservation to continue. This stability was not guaranteed, and in many places it did not last, but where it held, the process advanced quietly and without interruption. Within these settings, organic matter began to accumulate in a way that contrasted sharply with the surrounding world. Instead of disappearing, it remained, compacting slowly under its own weight. The accumulation did not require sudden abundance, but rather a steady input combined with limited removal. Over time, this balance allowed deposits to grow, each layer recording a moment that had not fully faded. Such conditions were rare, emerging only where multiple factors aligned with precision. The absence of oxygen alone was not sufficient, nor was the presence of abundant life. It required both, along with a stability that could persist across immense stretches of time. Where any of these elements failed, the system returned to its default state and accumulation ceased. These environments marked the first quiet deviation from the broader pattern, where the expected outcome of disappearance gave way to something more enduring. The material that gathered within them would not remain unchanged, but its continued presence created the foundation for processes that could unfold far beyond the reach of immediate transformation. Across the surface of the planet, the conditions that allow preservation remain the exception rather than the rule, and most regions pass quietly through time without ever holding on to what has lived within them. The balance required is delicate, and in most environments, it is never achieved, not because life is absent, but because the surrounding systems remain too active, too exposed, or too unstable to allow anything to endure. In many places, oxygen continues to move freely through water and sediment, sustaining the same processes that return organic material to its simplest form. This presence does not need to be overwhelming to be effective. Even small amounts, renewed consistently, are enough to support microbial communities that complete the cycle of breakdown. The earlier pattern persists, uninterrupted and efficient, ensuring that accumulation never begins. What settles is soon dissolved, and what might have remained is drawn back into circulation. Elsewhere, movement itself becomes the limiting factor. Environments shaped by shifting currents, changing layers, or frequent disturbance rarely allow material to remain undisturbed for long. Sediments are stirred, redistributed, or exposed again to conditions that favor decomposition. The surface and the depths remain connected in ways that prevent isolation, and without that separation, preservation cannot take hold. Stability, which is so essential in rare cases, is absent here, replaced by constant motion that resets the process again and again. There are also regions where life, though present, never reaches the density required to leave a lasting imprint. Growth may occur, but not at a scale that allows accumulation to outpace removal. The system remains balanced, with inputs matched by outputs, leaving no surplus to gather. Without sufficient biological productivity, even the most favorable conditions cannot produce meaningful deposits. The absence here is quiet, shaped not by destruction, but by limitation. These factors often combine, reinforcing one another across vast areas. A place rich in oxygen may also be subject to movement, while another with relative calm may lack the biological input needed to sustain accumulation. The alignment required for preservation depends on multiple conditions holding together at once, and in most parts of the Earth, at least one of these conditions fails. The process stops before it can begin, leaving behind no trace of what might have formed. Over immense spans of time, this pattern becomes embedded in the structure of the planet itself. Regions that never met these requirements remain unchanged in this regard, regardless of how much life passed through them. The absence of preserved material is not a temporary state, but a lasting characteristic shaped by conditions that persisted across entire eras. This widespread filtering shapes the uneven distribution that becomes visible much later. Only a small fraction of environments move beyond this stage, progressing toward accumulation and transformation. Everywhere else, the system continues as it always has, cycling life through appearance and disappearance without interruption. The result is a world where the potential for formation exists broadly, but the reality of it remains confined to specific places. The conditions that prevent accumulation are not rare. They are the norm, quietly ensuring that most of what once lived leaves no lasting trace beneath the surface. It does not happen all at once, but through a gradual settling that continues long after the last traces of motion have faded. Fine particles, carried from distant regions, begin to descend through the water in a steady and unbroken drift, arriving at the seafloor with quiet persistence. Each grain finds its place among what has already come to rest, adding to a surface that is never truly still, always receiving, always changing in ways too slow to notice in a single moment. At first, the accumulation is delicate, almost imperceptible. Thin layers form, barely distinguishable from one another, each composed of fragments shaped by distant processes. Over time, these layers begin to thicken, pressing gently downward under their own weight. What lies beneath becomes less exposed, gradually hidden from the conditions that once defined its surroundings. The boundary between surface and depth begins to shift, not through sudden change, but through steady addition. Within this growing sequence, organic material becomes enclosed, no longer in direct contact with the environment above. The earlier balance, already altered in rare settings, moves further away from its original state. As more sediment settles, pathways that once allowed interaction with the surface begin to narrow and close. The connection weakens, and with it, the influence of external conditions diminishes. This process introduces a form of isolation that deepens with time. The material below is not removed from the system entirely, but it becomes increasingly shielded from the forces that once acted upon it. Movement slows, exchange becomes limited, and what remains is held in place by the weight of what continues to gather above. Each new layer reinforces this separation, strengthening the conditions that allow the process to continue. The pace remains constant, shaped by distant sources that supply a continuous stream of sediment. Rivers carry fine particles from land, currents distribute them across wide areas, and gravity completes the final descent. Together, these processes maintain a flow that does not rely on sudden events, but on steady, ongoing input. The result is a gradual thickening that transforms the seafloor into a record of accumulation, each layer marking a moment in a sequence that extends across immense spans of time. As the layers build, pressure begins to increase, not abruptly, but as a natural consequence of depth. The weight above compresses what lies below, reducing the space between particles and bringing them into closer contact. Water is slowly displaced, and the structure becomes more compact, more defined. The transformation remains subtle at this stage, yet it sets the foundation for changes that will continue far beyond this point. What was once exposed now exists in a different state, enclosed within a growing mass that limits interaction with the surface world. The conditions surrounding it are no longer determined by open exchange, but by what is contained within the layers themselves. This shift marks a transition, not in appearance, but in process, where the influence of the surface fades and deeper forces begin to take precedence. Through this steady burial, the stage is set for further transformation, shaped not by rapid change, but by the quiet persistence of accumulation and the gradual separation from the world above. Time does not move here in the way it is usually imagined, marked by moments or measured in cycles that feel familiar. Instead, it unfolds as a continuous presence, stretching outward without urgency, allowing processes to proceed at a pace that rarely reveals itself in any single instant. What has been set in motion through accumulation and burial now enters a phase where change is governed almost entirely by duration, where the passage itself becomes the defining force. The material held within these layers remains still in appearance, yet it exists within an environment that is slowly shifting. Depth increases almost imperceptibly as more layers gather above, and with that, depth comes a gradual alteration in conditions. Temperature rises in subtle increments, and pressure continues to build, not as a sudden weight, but as a steady presence that grows over immense spans. These changes do not act quickly, and they do not produce immediate results. They require time in a form that extends far beyond ordinary experience. Within this extended duration, organic matter begins to transform in ways that cannot be observed directly. The structures that once defined it are altered, rearranged through slow chemical processes that unfold without interruption. Nothing about this transformation is abrupt. Each step depends on the continued presence of the conditions that surround it, and those conditions themselves depend on the persistence of time. Without sufficient duration, the process remains incomplete, held in an earlier state that never progresses further. What defines this stage is not intensity, but patience embedded within the system itself. The environment does not force rapid change. It allows change to occur gradually, guided by the steady influence of heat and pressure over vast intervals. This pace ensures that transformation remains controlled, unfolding in a sequence that cannot be accelerated without disrupting the conditions required for it to proceed. When viewed against human experience, this scale of time becomes difficult to place. Entire civilizations would rise and fade without marking any noticeable shift in the material below. Generations pass, landscapes change, and still the process continues at its own pace, unaffected by the rhythms above. What seems stable and unchanging at the surface is part of a much longer sequence unfolding beneath it. This extended duration also introduces a limitation. Because the process depends so heavily on time, it cannot be repeated quickly or replaced once it has been altered. The conditions that allow transformation require continuity across immense spans, and once that continuity is broken, it cannot simply be restored within a short interval. The system does not reset in a way that allows rapid repetition. It moves forward only as time allows. The result is a process that is both steady and irreversible, shaped by durations that far exceed immediate perception. What forms within these depths carries the imprint of that time, reflecting not just the conditions that surrounded it, but the immense span over which those conditions remained intact. Without that span, nothing would progress beyond its earliest stages, and the transformation would remain incomplete. In this way, time becomes the most essential element, not as a background to the process, but as the force that allows every other condition to take effect, ensuring that change unfolds slowly enough to endure. Far beneath the quiet layering above, conditions begin to shift in ways that are no longer subtle, though they still unfold without any visible motion. Depth introduces a new environment, one shaped not by external cycles but by the weight and warmth of the earth itself. What has been buried is carried downward into regions where temperature rises gradually, guided by the steady increase of geothermal energy moving upward from the interior. This rise in temperature is not sudden or extreme. It progresses in measured increments, increasing as depth deepens, creating a gradient that slowly alters the state of the material enclosed within the layers. Alongside this warmth, pressure continues to build, no longer just the weight of accumulating sediment, but the combined force of everything above compressing what lies below into tighter and more compact forms. Spaces that once existed between particles diminish, and the material becomes more unified, more constrained. Within this environment, the organic matter that had been preserved begins to respond to these new conditions. The structures that once remained partially intact now encounter forces that encourage change at a molecular level. Bonds begin to shift, not through abrupt reactions, but through gradual rearrangements influenced by both heat and pressure working together over extended periods. The process remains slow, yet it moves with a direction that was not present before. As compression increases, the material is forced into closer contact with the surrounding mineral framework. Fluids are gradually expelled, leaving behind a denser composition that reflects the conditions it now inhabits. The transformation is not yet complete, but it has clearly begun, moving beyond simple preservation into a stage where the nature of the material itself is altered. This change does not occur uniformly, but it progresses in a way that depends on depth, temperature, and the duration over which these conditions are maintained. The role of heat becomes increasingly significant as time continues. It provides the energy needed for chemical processes to advance, enabling the breakdown and reformation of complex organic compounds into simpler, more stable forms. These changes occur within a confined space, influenced by pressure that ensures the material remains contained, allowing the process to proceed without disruption. The balance between heat and pressure must remain within a certain range, as too little change would stall the process, while too much could lead to entirely different outcomes. What defines this stage is the quiet beginning of transformation, where the material transitions from what it once was into something that no longer resembles its original form. The process does not produce immediate results that can be observed directly, but it establishes the conditions necessary for further development. Each increment of temperature, each increase in pressure, contributes to a sequence that builds upon itself, gradually moving the material toward a new state. This phase marks a turning point, not through any sudden event, but through the steady influence of forces that operate continuously over immense spans. The environment deep below the surface becomes an active space of change, where what has been buried is reshaped by conditions that grow stronger with depth. It is within this setting that transformation truly begins, guided by the combined effects of heat, pressure, and time, working together in quiet persistence. At a certain depth, the material settles into a state that resists easy description, no longer recognizable as what it once was, yet not fully transformed into its final form. It exists in a quiet middle phase, shaped by the conditions that surround it, held within the structure of the rock that now encloses it. This stage does not reveal itself through movement or visible change, but through a slow internal reorganization that unfolds over immense stretches of time. The organic matter, altered by pressure and warmed by the gradual increase in temperature, becomes a dense, solid substance known as kerogen. It does not flow, and it does not migrate. Instead, it remains fixed within the fine spaces of the rock, bound tightly to the mineral framework that has formed around it. The earlier stages of accumulation and burial have led to this moment where the material is neither preserved in its original form nor yet released into a more mobile state. Kerogen forms as complex organic molecules are broken down and reassembled into structures that are more stable under the conditions of depth. The process is subtle, guided by the steady influence of heat and pressure, acting together over long durations. What emerges is not uniform, but varied, reflecting differences in the original material and the environment in which it was transformed. Despite this variation, it shares a common characteristic, a solid, carbon-rich composition that holds within it the potential for further change. This stage is hidden not only because it occurs deep beneath the surface, but because it remains locked within the rock itself. There are no visible signs that mark its presence from above. It occupies the smallest spaces, filling pores and binding with surrounding minerals, becoming part of the structure rather than something separate from it. Its existence is quiet, embedded within layers that continue to deepen and compress over time. The duration of this phase extends far beyond immediate perception. Kerogen can remain in this state for millions of years, unchanged in appearance, waiting within the conditions that allow it to persist. The transformation that began earlier does not stop here, but it slows, held within a balance that depends on the surrounding temperature and pressure. If these conditions remain within a certain range, the material stays as it is, stable and contained. As time continues, the environment may shift further, bringing the material closer to the point where it can change again. The gradual increase in temperature with depth becomes more significant, providing the energy needed for additional transformation. Yet, this transition does not occur instantly. It requires the continuation of the same slow processes that have shaped everything up to this point. Within this hidden stage, the material carries the imprint of its entire history, from the earliest accumulation to the pressures of burial. It exists as a bridge between what once lived and what will eventually emerge, held in place by the conditions that define its environment. The rock around it serves not only as a container, but as a participant in its transformation, shaping the path that lies ahead. Kerogen represents a pause within the process, not an end, but a moment of stillness where change continues at a pace that remains almost imperceptible, preparing the way for what follows without revealing itself to the surface above. Not every buried layer continues forward along the same path, even when time, pressure, and depth remain in place. There exists a narrow interval within the earth where conditions align with unusual precision, allowing the transformation to progress into a form that can eventually become oil. Outside of this interval, the process either slows to a near standstill or moves in a different direction entirely, shaped by the surrounding temperature that governs each stage. As depth increases, temperature rises steadily, guided by the natural gradient within the Earth. This rise does not produce a single outcome, but instead creates a range of possibilities depending on where the material settles within it. If the temperature remains too low, the transformation that began earlier cannot advance beyond its intermediate state. The energy required to rearrange molecular structures is insufficient, and the material remains largely unchanged, held in place without progressing further. In these cooler regions, time continues to pass and pressure remains present, yet the absence of sufficient heat prevents the next phase from unfolding. The material does not revert or disappear, but it lingers, unchanged in a way that reflects the limitations of its environment. The process pauses here, not through interruption, but through the absence of the conditions needed to continue. Deeper still, where temperature rises beyond this narrow range, a different outcome begins to take shape. The same forces that once guided the transformation now act with greater intensity, pushing the material beyond the state required for oil. Molecular structures continue to break apart, becoming simpler and more volatile. Instead of forming a liquid substance, the material transitions into gas, shaped by conditions that favor lighter, more mobile compounds. This shift does not occur abruptly, but through a gradual crossing of thresholds that depend on both temperature and time. The balance required for oil exists only within a specific interval, where heat is sufficient to drive transformation, but not so great as to carry it further into another state. This interval is often referred to as a window, not as a physical boundary, but as a range within which the necessary conditions coexist. The position of this window varies depending on the surrounding environment, influenced by factors such as depth, pressure, and the nature of the material itself. Yet regardless of these variations, the requirement remains the same. Only within this limited range can the transformation proceed in a way that leads toward the formation of oil. Outside of it, the path diverges, either remaining incomplete or continuing into a different outcome. What makes this stage significant is its rarity. The alignment of conditions needed to reach and remain within this window is uncommon, adding another layer of constraint to the overall process. Even where earlier stages have succeeded, reaching this interval is not guaranteed. The material must arrive at the correct depth, experience the appropriate temperature, and remain there long enough for the transformation to unfold. Within this narrow range, the process advances quietly, guided by the same slow persistence that has defined every stage before it. It is here that the conditions finally align in a way that allows the material to move beyond its intermediate form, continuing along a path that remains hidden far beneath the surface. Deep within the layered interior, beyond the reach of surface change, The material enters a phase where stillness gives way to transformation that can no longer be paused. The conditions that have been building over immense spans begin to align in a way that allows the dense, solid substance held within the rock to shift into something more fluid. This change does not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual release, unfolding quietly within the confined spaces where the material has long remained. Kerogen, once stable and unmoving, begins to break apart under the combined influence of heat and pressure. The complex structures that held it together are slowly rearranged, separating into smaller chains of hydrocarbons that carry different properties from what came before. This transformation does not disrupt the surrounding rock, nor does it produce visible signs at the surface. It remains entirely contained, progressing within the microscopic spaces where the material resides. As these hydrocarbons form, they begin to take on a liquid state, marking the emergence of oil deep underground. The transition is subtle, shaped by conditions that must remain within the narrow range described earlier. Too little heat would leave the kerogen unchanged, while too much would carry the transformation further, producing lighter substances instead. Within this balanced interval, the process unfolds steadily, guided by the same slow persistence that has defined every stage before it. The oil that forms does not collect immediately into visible pools or reservoirs. It exists first within the source rock itself, dispersed through tiny pores and fractures that run through the mineral structure. Each pocket of newly formed liquid occupies only a small space, held in place by the surrounding rock that still contains it. The distribution is uneven, reflecting the variations in temperature, pressure, and composition that define each region within the depth. This stage remains hidden not only because of its location far beneath the surface, but because of the scale at which it occurs. The transformation operates at a level too small to observe directly, involving changes that unfold within microscopic spaces over immense periods. There are no abrupt shifts or sudden releases, only a continuous progression that gradually increases the presence of liquid hydrocarbons within the rock. Time continues to play its role, ensuring that the process does not advance too quickly. The breakdown of kerogen into oil requires sustained conditions, maintained over durations that allow the transformation to proceed without interruption. Each increment of change depends on what came before, building slowly toward a state where the material no longer resembles its original form. As the amount of liquid increases, the rock begins to hold more than it can easily contain. The oil, less dense than its surroundings, exists in a state that will eventually lead to movement, though that movement has not yet begun. For now, it remains where it formed, confined within the structure that created it, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to shift. This moment marks the quiet birth of oil, not as a sudden appearance, but as the outcome of a long sequence of transformations that have unfolded far beneath the surface, beyond any direct observation, guided entirely by the slow and steady forces of the earth. Once formed, the liquid does not remain fixed within the rock that created it, even though its movement is not immediately apparent. Within the confined spaces of the source rock, a quiet imbalance begins to assert itself, driven by differences in density between the newly formed hydrocarbons and the surrounding material. The oil, lighter than the water and minerals around it, experiences a subtle upward tendency, one that does not act as a sudden force, but as a persistent direction that unfolds over immense spans of time. This movement begins at a scale too small to observe directly. The oil occupies microscopic pores, narrow channels that weave through the rock in complex and irregular patterns. These pathways are not open spaces in the way one might imagine, but intricate networks of tiny voids, each connected to others in ways that allow fluid to pass slowly from one point to the next. The process is gradual, shaped by the structure of the rock and the properties of the fluid itself. As pressure continues to build within the source rock, it encourages this migration. The confined hydrocarbons seek paths of lower resistance, moving incrementally through the available spaces. Each shift is small, often measured in distances that would seem insignificant on a human scale, yet over time these movements accumulate, allowing the oil to progress upward through the layered structure of the earth. The journey is neither direct nor uniform, but guided by the pathways that exist within the rock. Not all rock allows this movement equally. Some layers are more permeable, containing interconnected pores that facilitate the slow passage of fluid, while others are dense and resistant, limiting or halting the flow. The oil navigates this varied landscape by following the paths that offer the least resistance, gradually finding its way through formations that permit its passage. The process depends on both the properties of the oil and the characteristics of the surrounding rock, each influencing how and where movement can occur. Time remains a central factor in this migration. The distances involved are often considerable, and the speed at which the oil moves is extremely slow. What might seem like a negligible shift in a single year becomes significant only when extended across millions of years. The process unfolds continuously, without pause, guided by the persistent influence of buoyancy and pressure working together in quiet coordination. As the oil moves, it begins to separate from the rock in which it formed, entering new layers that may differ in composition and structure. This transition does not happen all at once, but through a series of gradual steps, each one carrying the fluid slightly farther from its origin. The migration does not guarantee accumulation, nor does it ensure that the oil will remain within the subsurface. It simply sets the stage for what may follow, allowing the fluid to travel through the earth in search of spaces where it can gather. Throughout this movement, the process remains hidden, unfolding entirely beneath the surface without any visible indication of its progress. The oil moves quietly, guided by forces that act steadily over immense durations, shaping its path through a landscape defined by the interplay of rock, pressure, and time. There are countless paths that lead upward, and most of them do not end in stillness. As the migrating fluid continues its slow ascent through permeable layers, it does not always encounter a place where it can pause and gather. Instead, it often finds only continuation, a network of connected spaces that guide it steadily closer to the surface, where the conditions that allowed its formation no longer exist. The movement described before carries with it an inherent risk, not of destruction in a sudden sense, but of quiet loss through persistence. Without a structure capable of halting its ascent, the oil continues to rise, following the same subtle forces that initiated its journey. The pathways do not close on their own, and in many regions, they remain open enough to allow the fluid to pass through without interruption. In these cases, accumulation never occurs, and the oil remains dispersed, never forming into a concentrated body. As it approaches shallower depths, the environment begins to change. Temperatures decrease, pressures lessen, and the surrounding conditions become less stable for maintaining the fluid in its subsurface state. If the oil continues upward without obstruction, it may eventually reach the surface, emerging slowly through fractures or porous zones that extend all the way to open air or water. This emergence is not dramatic. It happens gradually, often unnoticed, as small amounts seep out over long periods. Once exposed, the oil encounters an environment that quickly alters its form. Lighter components may evaporate, dispersing into the atmosphere, while heavier portions can be broken down by microorganisms or transformed through interaction with oxygen. What remains does not retain the structure it held below, and over time, it disappears, reintegrated into surface processes that leave little trace of its origin. The journey that began deep within the earth concludes quietly, without accumulation, without preservation. This outcome is not rare. In fact, it represents the most common fate of oil throughout the planet's history. For every instance where oil becomes trapped and stored, there are many more where it continues its path uninterrupted, eventually lost to the surface or dispersed within the subsurface without ever forming a reservoir. The process that creates oil does not guarantee its retention, and without the right conditions to contain it, the majority simply moves on. The absence of trapping structures acts as a filter, one that removes vast quantities from ever becoming accessible or even noticeable. Regions may produce oil in significant amounts, yet still hold little to none today because the pathways allowed it to escape. The formation and migration processes operate independently of storage, and without alignment between them, accumulation cannot occur. Over immense spans of time, this filtering effect shapes the distribution that exists in the present. It ensures that only a small fraction of what was formed remains stored beneath the surface. The rest has already completed its journey, dispersed and altered beyond recognition, leaving behind no clear record of its passage. This stage reveals a quiet imbalance within the system. Creation is widespread, but preservation is not. The Earth has produced far more oil than it has ever retained, and most of it has already moved through its final phase, leaving only a limited portion behind, held in place where conditions allowed it to remain. There are places within the subsurface where movement comes to a gradual halt, not because the forces driving it disappear, but because the path forward is quietly closed. As migrating oil continues its upward journey, it may encounter formations shaped by the slow deformation of the Earth's crust, structures that alter the direction of flow and create spaces where fluid can gather rather than pass through. These formations are not designed with intention, yet they function as barriers that interrupt an otherwise continuous ascent. Over immense spans of time, layers of rock have been bent, tilted, and compressed by the shifting movements of the planet. What was once horizontal can become curved or arched, forming shapes that influence how fluids behave within them. In certain configurations, these folded layers create upward bulges where oil moving through permeable rock is guided toward a higher point but finds no path to continue. The structure itself redirects the flow, concentrating it within a confined space. Faults introduce another form of interruption. These fractures, formed by the breaking and displacement of rock, can create boundaries between layers that differ in their ability to transmit fluids. When a permeable layer carrying oil meets a fault that seals against it, the path is effectively blocked. The oil accumulates against this boundary, unable to cross into the adjacent rock. The movement that once carried it upward is slowed, then halted, as it collects within the available space. Seals play a critical role in maintaining these accumulations. Certain rock types, composed of tightly packed minerals with little to no pore space, act as barriers that fluids cannot easily penetrate. When such impermeable layers sit above or alongside permeable ones, they create a natural enclosure. Oil migrating upward enters the porous layer, but cannot pass through the seal above, causing it to gather beneath it. The structure becomes a container, holding the fluid in place over long periods. These trapping structures depend on precise arrangements. The presence of a fold alone is not sufficient, nor is a fault without an effective seal. Each component must align in a way that allows oil to enter but prevents it from escaping. The geometry of the layers, the properties of the rock, and the timing of formation all contribute to whether a trap can form and persist. If any element is missing or misaligned, the oil continues its journey, never accumulating in a lasting way. The rarity of these structures reflects the complexity required for their formation. While the Earth's crust is constantly shifting, only certain movements produce the configurations needed to create effective traps. Many regions experience deformation without generating the specific arrangements that can hold oil. Even where such structures exist, they must coincide with the presence of migrating hydrocarbons to become meaningful. Within these formations, oil begins to collect, filling the available pore spaces in a manner shaped by both gravity and the surrounding fluids. The accumulation remains hidden, confined within the structure that contains it, isolated from the pathways that once allowed it to move freely. The process does not announce itself, but it marks a transition from movement to stillness, where the fluid becomes part of a localized system rather than a continuous flow. These structures, formed through slow geological processes, create the conditions necessary for oil to remain beneath the surface, preserving what would otherwise be lost to ongoing migration. Above certain hidden accumulations, there exists a layer that does not participate in the movement below, a boundary that quietly defines where the journey ends. This layer does not allow fluid to pass through it with ease, not because of any visible barrier, but because of its internal structure, tightly packed and resistant to the flow that has guided the oil upward for so long. It forms a surface that cannot be crossed, and in doing so, it changes everything beneath it. As oil continues its slow migration, it rises until it meets this impermeable boundary. The pathways that once allowed movement simply stop, and the fluid, unable to continue, begins to gather. The accumulation is gradual, shaped by the same forces that carried it upward, but now constrained within a space defined by both the rock below and the sealing layer above. The oil fills available pores, displacing other fluids and settling into a configuration determined by density and pressure. This upper layer, often composed of fine-grained materials such as shale or evaporite deposits, lacks the interconnected spaces needed for fluid to pass through. Its structure is dense, its permeability extremely low, creating an effective seal that prevents escape. The oil presses against it, but the barrier holds, maintaining the separation between what lies beneath and the conditions above. Without this resistance, the fluid would continue its ascent, eventually reaching the surface and dispersing. The presence of this cap rock transforms the system from one of movement into one of containment. Beneath it, the oil no longer travels freely, but remains confined, accumulating over time as more fluid arrives from below. The structure becomes a reservoir, not through the presence of oil alone, but through the combination of a permeable layer that can store it and an impermeable one that prevents its escape. Both are required, and neither can function alone to produce a lasting accumulation. The effectiveness of this seal depends on its continuity and integrity. Even small fractures or weaknesses can create pathways that allow the oil to leak through, reducing or eliminating the accumulation over time. The cap rock must remain intact, maintaining its impermeable nature across the entire structure. Where it does, the reservoir can persist for immense durations, holding the oil in place long after its formation and migration have concluded. This sealing process does not alter the oil itself, but it defines its fate. The fluid remains beneath the cap, isolated from the surface and protected from the processes that would otherwise disperse it. The conditions within the reservoir stabilize, shaped by pressure and the presence of other fluids, creating a system that can endure over geological time. Such formations are not widespread. They require a precise alignment of factors, including the presence of suitable rock layers, the correct structural configuration, and the timing of oil migration relative to the formation of the seal. Without any one of these elements, the system fails to retain the oil, and the accumulation never forms. In these rare settings, the cap rock serves as the final boundary, the quiet lid that holds everything in place, ensuring that what has traveled so far beneath the surface remains there, contained within the structure that now defines it. Within the confined space beneath a sealing layer, the nature of the rock itself determines whether oil can gather or simply pass through without forming anything lasting. The rock must possess a structure that allows it to hold fluid, not as a solid container, but as a network of interconnected spaces where oil can reside. These spaces are not large or easily visible, but they are essential, forming a hidden framework that defines whether accumulation can occur. Porosity becomes the key characteristic in this setting. It describes the presence of tiny voids within the rock, spaces that were created through earlier processes of deposition and compaction. In certain types of rock, such as sandstone or some forms of limestone, these voids remain open enough to store fluid. They do not exist as empty cavities in the usual sense, but as countless small openings distributed throughout the material, each capable of holding a fraction of what eventually becomes a reservoir. Equally important is permeability, the ability of these spaces to connect with one another. Storage alone is not sufficient. The oil must be able to move through the rock, flowing slowly from one pore to the next until it gathers beneath the sealing layer above. If the pores are isolated, the fluid becomes trapped in place before it can accumulate, dispersed in a way that prevents the formation of a larger body. Only when these spaces are linked does the system allow both movement and storage to occur together. The structure of the rock reflects its history. Grains that were once loosely arranged may have been compacted over time, reducing the size of the spaces between them. In some cases, minerals carried by fluids have filled these spaces, sealing them off and eliminating their ability to store or transmit oil. What remains is a rock that appears similar on the surface, yet behaves entirely differently beneath, unable to support accumulation despite the presence of migrating hydrocarbons. This variation introduces another layer of limitation. Even in regions where oil has formed, migrated, and encountered a suitable seal, the absence of an appropriate reservoir rock prevents it from gathering. The fluid continues to move or remains scattered, never reaching the concentration required to form a reservoir. The process depends on the alignment of multiple conditions, and the presence of a porous and permeable rock is among the most critical. Within suitable reservoir rocks, oil occupies the available spaces alongside other fluids, arranged according to their relative densities. It does not fill the rock completely, but shares it with water and gas, each occupying different positions within the pore network. The distribution is shaped by both physical properties and the structure of the rock itself, creating a balance that remains stable as long as the surrounding conditions are maintained. These rocks do not announce their presence from the surface. They are hidden within layers that reveal little about their internal structure, yet they play a decisive role in determining where oil can be stored. Their rarity reflects the specific conditions required for their formation and preservation, adding another step in the sequence that limits where reservoirs can exist. In this way, the ability of rock to hold and transmit fluid becomes a defining factor, ensuring that only certain regions, where these properties align with all previous conditions, can support the accumulation that remains beneath the surface. When all of these processes are considered together, a pattern begins to emerge, not as a simple chain, but as a sequence of narrowing paths, each one removing possibilities until only a few remain. The Earth does not lack the ingredients needed for oil formation, yet the combination required is so specific that most regions never progress beyond the earliest stages. What appears uneven on the surface is the result of this gradual filtering shaped by conditions that must align across both space and time. The initial presence of life alone does not determine the outcome. It must exist in sufficient density and persist long enough to contribute meaningfully to accumulation. Even then, the environment must shift in a way that allows preservation rather than complete return. This first narrowing removes vast areas from the process, leaving only those rare settings where organic material can remain long enough to continue its transformation. From there, burial must occur in a manner that isolates and protects what has been preserved, followed by the steady influence of time, pressure, and temperature acting together within a specific range. Each of these stages introduces its own limitations. A slight deviation, too little heat, too much disturbance, or insufficient depth can halt progress entirely. The process does not adapt or compensate. It simply stops where conditions no longer support it. Even where transformation succeeds, the resulting material must then migrate, and in doing so, it encounters another layer of uncertainty. Without pathways that allow movement, it remains confined. With too many pathways, it escapes. The balance required for successful migration without loss is delicate, shaped by the structure of the surrounding rock and the forces acting upon it. Many regions fail at this stage, losing what they have produced before it can accumulate. The presence of trapping structures introduces yet another requirement. The alignment of permeable layers, sealing formations, and suitable reservoir rocks must occur together, each component dependent on the others. These structures do not form everywhere, and even where they do, they must coincide with the arrival of migrating oil. If the timing or configuration is incomplete, accumulation does not occur. Each step in this sequence acts as a filter, removing regions that cannot meet the necessary conditions. The process does not rely on a single rare event, but on the repeated alignment of multiple rare conditions, each one reducing the number of places where oil can form, survive, and remain stored. By the time all requirements are considered together, only a small fraction of the Earth's surface remains capable of supporting the entire sequence. This layered filtering explains why oil is not distributed evenly across the planet. Some regions may meet several of the conditions but fail at one critical stage, while others may never progress beyond the beginning. Only a few areas, shaped by a specific combination of geological history, environmental stability, and structural formation, meet every requirement. The imbalance that results is not random, but the natural outcome of a process that depends on precision across immense spans of time. What remains beneath the surface today reflects this long sequence of constraints, where only certain regions were able to carry the process from beginning to end without interruption. The surface of the Earth carries a sense of permanence, yet over immense spans it has never remained in a fixed arrangement. What appears stable within a human lifetime is part of a slow and continuous motion where vast sections of the planet shift, separate, and collide, guided by forces operating deep within the interior. This movement unfolds without urgency, measured not in years or centuries, but across intervals that reshape entire regions. Land masses that now seem firmly rooted have traveled great distances, carried along by the motion of tectonic plates that glide over the underlying mantle. These plates do not move in isolation. They interact, diverging in some places, converging in others, and occasionally sliding past one another. Through these interactions, the positions of continents change gradually, altering the distribution of oceans and land over time. In earlier periods, areas that are now dry and exposed once lay beneath shallow seas, their surfaces covered by water that supported conditions very different from those seen today. The transformation from ocean to land does not occur abruptly, but through the steady accumulation of changes driven by tectonic activity. Uplift raises sections of the crust, while other areas subside, allowing water to move in or retreat. Over long durations, these shifts redefine entire landscapes, replacing one environment with another. The significance of this movement extends beyond the surface. The environments that existed in the past leave behind materials and structures that remain long after the conditions that created them have disappeared. Sediments deposited in ancient seas become part of the rock record, preserving within them the outcomes of processes that unfolded millions of years earlier. When these regions later emerge as land, they carry with them the hidden imprint of their earlier state. This continuity between past and present means that the distribution of resources is shaped not by current conditions alone, but by the environments that once existed in the same location. A region that now appears dry, with little indication of its history, may contain within its subsurface the results of processes that required water, stability, and biological activity. The absence of these conditions today does not erase what occurred in the past. Plate tectonics acts as the mechanism that connects these distant states. By moving continents across the surface of the planet, it places regions into new climates and settings while preserving the structures formed under previous conditions. The rocks remain, even as the environment changes around them, creating a layered history that reflects multiple stages of the Earth's evolution. This shifting arrangement also explains why certain regions share similarities despite being separated by large distances today. They may have once been part of the same system, connected within a single environment that later broke apart as the plates moved. The resources they contain reflect that shared origin, even though their present surroundings differ. Over time, this process produces a surface that appears complex and uneven, with patterns that can only be understood by considering the movement that shaped them. The present distribution of environments and materials is the result of countless adjustments, each one building upon the last, guided by forces that operate far below the surface. What exists today is therefore a snapshot within a much longer sequence, where the position of land and sea continues to change, carrying with it the history of environments that no longer exist but still influence what remains beneath the surface. Long before the present arrangement of land took shape, there existed a broad expanse of water that stretched across regions now separated by deserts and mountains. This ocean did not resemble the deeper, colder basins that dominate much of the modern world. It was wide, shallow, and sustained by a balance of warmth and light that allowed it to support conditions unlike those found elsewhere. Its presence covered areas that would one day become part of the Middle East, though at the time, no such boundaries existed, only a continuous marine environment extending across a vast portion of the planet. The waters of this ocean remained relatively calm over long periods, shaped by geography that limited strong disturbances and allowed stability to persist. Shallow depths meant that sunlight could penetrate easily, reaching large areas of the seafloor and maintaining a consistent input of energy. This steady illumination supported continuous biological activity, allowing life to exist in a sustained and uninterrupted cycle. The environment did not depend on brief surges of productivity, but on a persistent presence that remained stable across immense durations. Within this setting, the conditions described earlier aligned with unusual consistency. The balance between light, temperature, and nutrient availability created an environment where biological material could be produced at a scale that extended across entire regions. The system was not isolated to a single location, but spread broadly, creating a unified environment where similar processes unfolded simultaneously over large distances. This continuity allowed the accumulation of organic material to occur on a scale that would later become significant. At the same time, the structure of the water column in certain areas allowed for the development of zones where oxygen was limited. These regions did not form everywhere, but where they did, they created conditions that reduced the breakdown of organic remains. The combination of high productivity at the surface and reduced decomposition below allowed material to persist in ways that were uncommon in most other environments. This alignment of factors, both at the surface and below, created a system capable of supporting the early stages of oil formation across a wide area. The geography of this ocean also contributed to its stability. Surrounded by land masses that influenced circulation patterns, the waters remained relatively enclosed, allowing conditions to remain consistent over long periods. This stability ensured that the processes unfolding within it were not frequently disrupted, allowing accumulation and preservation to continue without interruption. The environment did not need to constantly reset, and in that continuity, it gained the ability to produce lasting effects. Over time, as the movement of the Earth's plates reshaped the surface, this ocean began to change. Sections of it were lifted, others receded, and what was once a continuous marine system gradually gave way to the landforms that exist today. Yet the materials formed within it did not disappear. They remained beneath the surface, preserved within layers that recorded the conditions of that earlier time. This ancient ocean represents a moment where multiple rare conditions aligned across a vast region, creating an environment uniquely suited for the processes that would follow. Its existence provides a foundation for understanding why certain areas now hold significant amounts of oil, not because of their present state, but because of what they once were, long before the surface took on its current form. What set this ancient sea apart was not a single feature, but a quiet alignment of conditions that held together over time without interruption. Its surface received a steady and reliable flow of energy, not in bursts, but as a constant presence that allowed biological activity to continue without collapse. The water remained warm across wide areas, reducing the seasonal variation that might otherwise disrupt growth, and this consistency allowed life to persist in a way that rarely faltered. Within these waters, productivity reached levels that were not only sustained but widespread. The processes that supported growth operated continuously, fueled by nutrients that circulated through the system in a balanced exchange. These nutrients did not become depleted, nor were they introduced in unstable surges. Instead, they moved gradually, supporting a level of biological output that extended across vast regions. The system did not depend on isolated pockets of activity. It functioned as a broad and connected environment where similar conditions prevailed over long distances. Beneath this surface activity, certain areas developed characteristics that altered the fate of what was produced above. In deeper or more restricted zones, oxygen became limited, not entirely absent, but reduced enough to change the outcome of decomposition. These conditions did not dominate the entire ocean, yet where they appeared, they created pockets where organic material could persist longer than usual. The interaction between high production at the surface and reduced breakdown below created a pathway for accumulation that was rarely sustained elsewhere. The structure of the water itself contributed to this separation. Layers formed that limited mixing, allowing deeper regions to remain isolated from the oxygen rich conditions above. This stratification did not need to be absolute to be effective. Even a partial separation was enough to reduce the rate at which organic material was broken down, allowing fragments to settle and remain. Over time, these fragments began to gather, forming deposits that reflected the balance between input and preservation. Stability extended beyond the vertical structure of the water. The broader environment remained relatively undisturbed over long periods, with fewer disruptions from tectonic activity or rapid shifts in sea level. This allowed the system to maintain its internal balance, ensuring that the conditions supporting accumulation were not frequently reset. The continuity of this environment played a central role, as even minor disturbances could have reintroduced oxygen or disrupted the layers that allowed preservation to occur. The combination of these factors created a setting where accumulation could proceed steadily, without interruption. High biological productivity ensured a continuous supply of material, while localized low oxygen conditions allowed portions of that material to persist. The stability of the environment ensured that this balance was maintained across durations long enough to produce meaningful deposits. What emerged was not an isolated event, but a sustained process operating across a wide region. The alignment of these conditions did not happen everywhere, and where any element was missing, the system returned to its default state. In this particular ocean, however, the balance held, allowing the processes described earlier to unfold in a way that was both extensive and enduring. This combination of sustained productivity, partial preservation, and long-term stability created an environment uniquely suited for the accumulation of organic material, setting the stage for what would later become one of the most significant concentrations of oil beneath the surface. Even after formation, migration, and trapping have aligned, the story does not end in certainty. What has gathered beneath the surface remains subject to the slow, persistent forces that continue to shape the Earth itself. The same movements that once created favorable conditions can later alter them, introducing a final stage where preservation depends not only on what has formed, but on what remains unchanged afterward. In regions where the subsurface remains relatively stable, the structures that hold oil can endure across immense spans of time. The layers stay intact, the seals remain unbroken, and the pressures within the reservoir adjust gradually without disruption. These environments experience little disturbance, allowing the accumulated oil to remain in place, held within the formations that first captured it. The passage of time does not erase these reservoirs, but instead reinforces their persistence, preserving them beneath the surface as quiet records of earlier processes. Elsewhere, the situation unfolds differently. The Earth's crust is not static, and in many regions it continues to shift, fold, and fracture long after oil has formed and gathered. Tectonic activity introduces movement that can distort or break the structures responsible for containment. A fold may be altered, a fault may shift, or a sealing layer may fracture, creating pathways that did not previously exist. These changes do not occur instantly, but over extended periods, gradually reshaping the subsurface environment. When such disruptions take place, the balance that once held the oil in place can be lost. Pathways reopen, allowing the fluid to move once again, escaping from the structures that had confined it. The migration process resumes, carrying the oil toward new locations or, in many cases, back toward the surface where it is eventually dispersed. The accumulation that once existed becomes reduced or entirely removed, leaving behind only traces of what had been preserved. The difference between these outcomes depends on the stability of the region over time. Areas that experience minimal tectonic disturbance are more likely to retain their reservoirs as the structures remain intact and the seals continue to function. In contrast, regions subject to frequent or intense movement often lose what they have accumulated, as the conditions required for preservation are gradually undone. This introduces a third level of filtering, one that operates after all previous stages have been completed. Even where oil has formed, migrated, and been successfully trapped, its continued existence depends on the long term stability of the surrounding geology. Without this stability, the earlier alignment of conditions becomes temporary, and the accumulation is eventually lost. Over immense spans, this process further reduces the number of regions where oil remains stored beneath the surface. Many areas may have once contained significant accumulations, only to lose them through gradual geological change. What remains today represents those locations where not only formation and trapping occurred, but where the structures endured without disruption. The result is a landscape shaped not only by what conditions once allowed, but by what conditions continued to permit. Stability becomes the final requirement, ensuring that what has formed and gathered is not undone by the same forces that shaped it, allowing certain regions to retain their hidden reservoirs while others quietly lose them over time. In certain regions, the sequence did not break. Each stage that so often failed elsewhere continued forward, carried by a rare continuity that allowed the entire process to unfold from beginning to end without interruption. What distinguishes these areas is not a single advantage, but the quiet convergence of many, each one aligning with the next across spans of time that rarely hold such precision. The early environment provided a sustained presence of life, not as isolated bursts, but as a continuous system that remained active across wide areas. This consistency ensured that organic material was produced in quantities sufficient to move beyond the limits that constrained most regions. The output did not fluctuate dramatically, and it did not collapse under changing conditions. It persisted, forming the initial foundation required for everything that followed. From there, the transition into preservation occurred without disruption. The balance between production and breakdown shifted in a way that allowed organic material to remain, supported by conditions that limited its return to simpler forms. This stage, often brief or incomplete elsewhere, held steady, allowing accumulation to continue over long durations. The material did not disperse or disappear, but remained in place long enough to become part of a growing sequence. Burial followed with similar continuity. Sediments arrived steadily, covering what had been preserved and isolating it from the surface environment. The layers built without significant disturbance, maintaining the conditions required for transformation. Depth increased gradually, bringing with it the changes in temperature and pressure needed to move the process forward. Nothing in this stage occurred abruptly, yet nothing interrupted it either. As transformation progressed, the material entered the narrow range where oil could form, guided by conditions that remained within the necessary limits. The alignment of temperature and pressure held long enough for the conversion to occur, avoiding the extremes that would have halted or redirected the process. This balance, so easily disrupted in other regions, remained intact here, allowing the formation of liquid hydrocarbons to proceed. Migration then carried the oil upward, but not into loss. The pathways allowed movement without dispersal, guiding the fluid into structures that could contain it. Trapping formations were present, shaped by the geological history of the region in a way that created spaces for accumulation. These structures did not form after the oil had passed, but existed in alignment with its movement, allowing it to gather rather than escape. Above these accumulations, sealing layers remained intact, preventing further ascent. The oil, once mobile, became confined, held within reservoir rocks that could store it effectively. These rocks possessed the necessary properties to allow both movement and retention, completing the system required for a stable reservoir. What followed was equally important. The region remained geologically stable over immense spans, preserving what had formed. The structures that held the oil were not broken or displaced, and the conditions that allowed accumulation were not undone. While other regions experienced shifts that released their contents, these areas retained theirs, protected by a continuity that extended far beyond the moment of formation. This combination of sustained productivity, preservation, burial, transformation, migration, trapping, and long-term stability created a sequence that remained unbroken. Each stage supported the next, forming a continuous path that only a few regions were able to follow completely. It is within these rare alignments that large accumulations remained, not through chance, but through the uninterrupted progression of every condition required. Across much of the planet, the sequence narrows and then quietly breaks, not through a single failure, but through small absences that compound over time. A region may carry the memory of earlier stages, yet lack one element that allows the process to continue. In these places, the chain does not fully connect, and what might have formed remains incomplete, dispersed, or entirely absent beneath the surface. Some areas never move beyond the earliest steps. Life may have existed, but not in the sustained abundance required to build meaningful accumulation. The balance between growth and removal remained even, leaving no excess to gather over time. Without that initial surplus, the later stages have nothing to act upon, and the process ends before it begins to take shape beneath the surface. In other regions, the early conditions briefly aligned, allowing organic material to persist, yet the continuity required for burial did not hold. Disturbances interrupted the layering process, exposing material to environments that favored its return to simpler forms. The sequence resets, and what might have progressed is instead lost, leaving behind no lasting imprint of what had briefly existed. There are also places where burial and transformation occurred, where material moved through stages that brought it closer to becoming oil. Yet, without the precise range of conditions needed for that final conversion, the process stalls or diverges. The material remains in an intermediate state or follows a different path, never reaching the form that would allow it to migrate and accumulate. Even where oil does form, the outcome is not assured. Migration introduces uncertainty, and in many regions, the pathways remain too open. The fluid continues its ascent without encountering structures capable of containing it. It moves steadily upward until it reaches environments where it can no longer remain intact, dispersing gradually and leaving no reservoir behind. The journey completes itself without ever settling. In some cases, the necessary structures exist, but they do not align with the movement of the oil. The timing differs, or the configuration lacks the precision needed to hold what arrives. The fluid passes through or around these formations, unable to gather in a way that creates lasting accumulation. The presence of individual conditions is not enough. They must occur together in sequence and without interruption. There are also regions where accumulation once occurred but did not endure. The structures that held the oil were altered over time, allowing it to escape. What had been preserved is slowly released, returning to the same processes that govern the surface. The absence that remains is not from a lack of formation, but from a loss that unfolded gradually over long durations. Each of these variations contributes to a broader pattern where most regions fail at one stage or another. The process does not allow for partial success. It requires a continuous alignment of conditions, and where any element is missing, the sequence ends. The imbalance that results is not sudden or arbitrary, but built from these small divergences repeated across the surface of the planet. What remains is a world where only a limited number of regions carry the full outcome of the process, while the majority reflect paths that began but did not continue, leaving behind little or nothing beneath the surface. There are traces, scattered and faint, that hint at what once existed in far greater amounts than what remains today. These traces appear not as hidden reservoirs, but as subtle releases at the surface, places where oil has slowly emerged over long periods, never gathering, never preserved, but instead returning to the environment in a gradual and almost unnoticed way. They mark the final stage of a process that, in most cases, does not end in accumulation. As oil moves upward through the subsurface, it sometimes reaches pathways that extend all the way to the surface. These pathways may be narrow fractures or zones of porous material that connect deeper layers to open air or shallow water. The movement is slow, guided by the same forces that initiated it, yet without any structure to contain it. The oil continues its ascent until it can rise no further. What follows is not a sudden release, but a steady seep, a quiet emergence that can persist over immense spans of time. At the surface, the environment changes completely. The conditions that once preserved and transformed the material are no longer present, replaced by exposure to oxygen, temperature variation, and biological activity. The oil begins to alter almost immediately, its lighter components evaporating into the air, leaving behind heavier fractions that remain for a time before undergoing further change. The transformation continues, but now it leads toward dispersion rather than preservation. Microorganisms play a significant role in this stage. Bacteria that thrive in surface conditions begin to break down the remaining hydrocarbons, using them as a source of energy. This process unfolds gradually, reducing the oil into simpler compounds that reintegrate into the surrounding environment. What had taken immense spans of time to form is now returned, step by step, to the systems that dominate at the surface. These seeps do not occur in isolation. Across the planet, countless locations have experienced this slow release, each one representing a portion of what once existed below. Some are visible, forming dark stains or subtle films, while others remain hidden, occurring beneath layers of soil or within shallow waters. Regardless of their visibility, they share the same outcome, a gradual loss that leaves little behind. Over geological time, this process has removed vast quantities of oil from the subsurface. For every accumulation that remains, there are many more that never persisted, either because they were never trapped or because the structures that once held them were altered. The majority of oil formed throughout Earth's history has followed this path, moving upward and dispersing before it could be preserved. This loss is not abrupt or dramatic. It unfolds slowly, carried by the same steady processes that define every stage of the system. The oil does not vanish in a single moment, but fades over time, its presence reduced until it becomes part of the broader environment once again. What remains today represents only a fraction of what was once produced. The reservoirs that exist beneath the surface are the result of rare alignments that allowed oil to be both formed and retained. Everything else has already completed its journey, returning quietly to the surface and beyond, leaving behind only faint indications of its passage through the earth. Long before any tools could reach beneath the surface, oil revealed itself in subtle ways, appearing where the ground seemed to darken or where a thin sheen gathered upon still water. These natural seeps offered the first quiet contact between human observation and a substance that had traveled immense distances from its place of origin. They did not present themselves as vast reserves, but as small and persistent traces, emerging slowly from the earth over long periods. Early human communities encountered these seeps without knowledge of their origin, yet their presence did not go unnoticed. The material possessed qualities that distinguished it from the surrounding environment. It could burn, adhere, and resist water, making it useful in simple and practical ways. It was gathered and used for purposes such as sealing containers, waterproofing surfaces, or providing a source of light when ignited. These uses were limited in scale, shaped by what could be collected directly from the surface, and remained tied to locations where the oil appeared naturally. For long stretches of history, this interaction remained unchanged. Oil was known only where it revealed itself, and its availability depended entirely on natural seepage. Beneath the surface, vast quantities existed, yet they remained beyond reach, hidden within layers that could not be accessed with the tools available at the time. The knowledge of its existence did not extend to an understanding of its origin or distribution, and its use remained localized and constrained. A shift began when the idea of reaching below the surface took form, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual extension of existing practices. Techniques used for accessing water or minerals were adapted, allowing deeper layers to be explored. Early drilling methods were simple, relying on manual effort and basic tools, yet they marked the beginning of a new approach. Instead of waiting for oil to emerge, it became possible to seek it out where it was believed to exist. As these methods developed, the depth that could be reached increased, and with it, the potential to access larger quantities of oil. The transition from surface collection to subsurface extraction changed the scale of what was possible. Oil that had been confined within reservoirs, held in place by geological structures, could now be brought to the surface in controlled ways. The process remained gradual, evolving through experimentation and refinement over time. With each improvement in drilling technology, the connection between human activity and deep geological processes became more direct. Wells extended further into the earth, guided by growing knowledge of where oil might be found. The hidden accumulations, formed through the long sequence of conditions described earlier, became accessible, transforming oil from a localized resource into one that could be obtained on a much larger scale. This transition did not alter the origin of oil itself, but it changed how it interacted with human systems. What had once been limited to surface traces became part of a broader network of extraction and use, shaped by the ability to reach into the depths where it had remained for millions of years. The quiet seeps that first revealed its presence remained, but they were no longer the only way oil could be found, as access extended far beyond what the surface alone could offer. From the surface perspective of the modern world, oil appears in volumes that suggest continuity, as though it belongs naturally to the present rather than to a distant sequence of formation. It flows through systems of extraction and distribution with a consistency that masks the conditions required for its existence. What is seen is not the long process that created it, but the concentrated result, gathered into reservoirs that can be accessed with increasing efficiency. These reservoirs, formed through the alignment of many rare conditions, hold oil in quantities that seem disproportionate to the processes that produce them. The accumulation is not spread evenly, but concentrated within specific regions where the sequence remained uninterrupted. When accessed, these concentrations give the impression of abundance, as large volumes can be brought to the surface from a relatively confined area. The scale of extraction reflects the scale of accumulation, not the frequency with which such accumulations occur. Modern methods have extended this perception further. Drilling techniques have become more precise, allowing access to reservoirs that were once difficult to reach. Equipment operates at depths and under conditions that would have been impossible in earlier periods, retrieving oil from formations that remain hidden beneath layers of rock. The process is controlled and continuous, capable of sustaining a steady flow that integrates seamlessly into global systems. This efficiency creates a sense of immediacy. Oil appears as something that can be produced on demand, its presence tied to the act of extraction rather than to the immense durations that made it possible. The infrastructure surrounding it reinforces this impression, with networks designed to move and refine it as though it were part of an ongoing and renewable process. Yet the reality beneath this surface activity remains unchanged. The formation of oil does not operate on the same timescale as its use. The processes that led to its creation unfolded over millions of years, shaped by conditions that rarely align. Each reservoir represents a long sequence of events that cannot be repeated within the span of human activity. Once extracted, the material is removed from that sequence entirely, with no immediate pathway for replacement. The contrast between formation and use introduces a quiet limitation. The rate at which oil is consumed far exceeds the rate at which it could ever be produced again under natural conditions. The abundance observed today reflects the presence of stored reserves rather than an ongoing cycle of formation. What appears continuous is in fact finite, defined by the quantities that have already been accumulated beneath the surface. As extraction continues, the remaining reserves become a reflection of what has yet to be accessed, not of what is being newly formed. The system operates on a foundation built in the distant past, drawing from deposits that have persisted through immense spans of time. The perception of abundance arises from the ability to access these deposits efficiently, rather than from the existence of a process that replenishes them. In this way, oil occupies a position that connects the present to a much older sequence. It feels immediate because it is accessible, yet its origin remains tied to conditions that no longer exist in the same form, making its supply inherently limited despite the scale at which it is used today. There is a quiet contrast between the pace at which oil comes into existence and the pace at which it is removed, a difference that does not announce itself in any single moment, but becomes apparent when both are placed within the same frame of time. The processes that created these reserves unfolded slowly, guided by accumulation, burial, transformation, and preservation across immense durations that extend far beyond ordinary experience. Each stage depended on continuity, requiring spans of time that allowed gradual change to build upon itself without interruption. By comparison, the rate at which oil is extracted exists on an entirely different scale. What took millions of years to form can be brought to the surface and used within a fraction of that time, compressed into periods that fit within human lifetimes. The systems that enable this extraction operate continuously, drawing from reservoirs with a consistency that reflects present demand rather than the distant conditions that created them. The result is a flow that appears steady, yet is rooted in a process that cannot match its speed. This difference is not simply a matter of measurement, but of alignment between two processes that do not share the same rhythm. Formation depends on conditions that are rare and slow to develop, while use depends on systems designed for efficiency and immediacy. The two exist together, yet they do not operate in balance. One unfolds over geological time, the other within historical time, and the distance between them defines the nature of the resource itself. As extraction continues, the reserves that remain become a reflection of what has yet to be accessed, rather than what is being newly formed. The process does not replenish itself in a way that can be observed within the present. The material being used today represents a continuation of what was created long ago, not the result of ongoing formation at a comparable rate. This creates a progression where each moment of use draws from a fixed foundation established in the distant past. The implications of this difference extend beyond immediate observation. The steady removal of oil does not produce a visible change in the short term, as reservoirs are large enough to sustain extraction across extended periods. Yet, over longer spans, the imbalance becomes more apparent, as the quantity remaining gradually decreases without a corresponding process to restore it. The system moves in one direction, shaped by the difference in pace between formation and use. This contrast introduces a broader perspective on time itself, highlighting how processes that appear continuous within one scale can be limited when viewed across another. The availability of oil is not defined solely by its presence beneath the surface, but by the relationship between how it was formed and how it is consumed. The two processes remain connected, yet they do not move together, creating a quiet tension that underlies the entire system. What exists today reflects the intersection of these timescales, where the results of deep time are brought into the present at a pace that does not allow for renewal. The difference in speed remains constant, shaping the way the resource is used and understood, even as the processes that created it continue far below, unfolding too slowly to influence the present in any immediate way. Beneath the steady rhythms of the present, there remains a quieter story, one that does not move at the same pace as the world above it. It exists in layers that hold the memory of conditions long gone, where the material now drawn upward began as part of living systems that once filled ancient seas. What is used today carries with it that distant origin, unchanged in its connection even as its form has been transformed. Oil, in its current state, appears uniform and utilitarian, shaped by the processes that refine and distribute it. Yet within it lies the residue of countless organisms that once moved within vast environments, each contributing, in small and nearly invisible ways, to the accumulation that followed. These contributions were not singular or isolated, but continuous, building over spans of time that allowed entire ecosystems to settle, layer upon layer, into the depths below. As the narrative has unfolded, each stage has revealed how unlikely this outcome is. The formation required abundance, preservation, transformation, migration, and containment, each dependent on conditions that rarely align. The presence of oil in any given place reflects not a single event, but a sequence that remained uninterrupted across immense durations. What exists now is the result of that continuity carried forward into the present through processes that have long since ceased. The modern world interacts with this material in ways that emphasize its availability, drawing it into systems that operate with precision and speed. Energy flows outward from these reserves, powering structures and movements that define daily life. The connection between this activity and its origin remains largely unseen, yet it persists, linking each moment of use to a time when the world was arranged in entirely different ways. In this connection, there is a quiet continuity between past and present. The material that fuels contemporary systems is not separate from the environments that produced it, but an extension of them, preserved across time and brought into a new context. Each use reflects a transfer, a movement from deep geological history into immediate experience carried out without altering the origin that remains embedded within it. The uneven distribution, the rarity of conditions, and the long durations involved all shape how this resource exists today. It is not found everywhere, and it is not formed continuously, yet where it remains, it does so as a concentrated record of processes that unfolded over vast spans. The presence of these reservoirs offers a glimpse into those earlier conditions held within the structure of the Earth itself. As attention returns to the surface, the contrast between these timescales remains. The world that operates on oil moves quickly, while the processes that created it remain distant and slow, unfolding beyond direct observation. The connection between them persists, nonetheless, bridging the present with a past that continues to influence it in subtle and enduring ways. What lies beneath is not only a source of energy, but a reflection of how the planet has changed, recorded in forms that can still be accessed. The story does not end with its use, but continues in the understanding that each drop carries with it a fragment of a much older world, still present, still shaping the one that exists today.